It is now my pleasure to introduce David Marx, CEO of Outcome Engineering, a Dallas, Texas-based risk management firm. In 1997, David launched a research and consulting practice focusing on the management of human error through the integration of systems engineering, human factors, and the law. In the area of safety culture, David authored for the National Institutes of Health the document Patient Safety and the Just Culture, a primer for healthcare executives. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Marx. Here's the advance.
Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you. I have to announce I am an engineer and an attorney. My wife says I went to engineering school, that's where I lost my personality. And I went to law school, and that's where I lost my soul. So you could take this for what it's worth. I know there are a lot of employers in the room. Actually, what I'm going to speak about speaks not only to healthcare providers. I'm going to talk about work around the country around this topic that we're going to call a just culture. But also applies in airlines are going down this path and have been down this path for some time. It applies in many areas as employers, so it's not only speaking to healthcare providers but to employers as well. I want to start though with a story. It was 2006, September 25th. It was the 23rd anniversary of the first date I had with my wife. We got married right after college. It was a midterm graduation for me, and so our wedding day was December 22nd, so it now becomes a de facto shopping day run to Toys R Us. So it's not the romantic evening my wife and I would hope for. So we celebrate September 25th of every year. We have a anniversary dinner and things. And my wife said a couple of years ago, she said, "Dave, I'm going to plan the date." And she picked a little restaurant. It was a house converted to a restaurant, had a patio out back, a jazz band, and this is all in our little community of Allen, Texas, a suburb of Dallas. And my wife said, "Dave, all you got to do is just be prepared to go on the date. I'm taking care of the whole thing." And she went during the day. She took roses. She pre-selected the bottle of red wine we would have. She went all out to prepare this evening. I hop in the shower at about 5 o'clock, and I notice while I'm showering that I have this rash on my leg. I'm thinking, I think I've hit, it's a weekend, I think it's a Saturday, and I think I'm having some kind of allergic reaction. So I decided I was going to be proactive with my health care. So I went into our little version of the formulary, and I wanted to pull out what was going to deal with this allergic reaction. If you think you've had an allergic reaction, what do you take? Benadryl. Sure, I popped 2 Benadryl. Headed off on my date. We arrive at the restaurant, and the restaurant knows this is a very special occasion, so they toast us at the door with 2 glasses of champagne. We're eating our New York steaks, and we're halfway through our bottle of Cabernet. And my wife looks across the table. It's about 8 o'clock right now. She's looking across the table, and she notices that my eyes are shut. I had fallen asleep right in the middle of the date, and she nudged me and said something to the effect of, had I not been in love with you for all these years, I'd take offense. And, I was just coming out of the sleep. I said, honey, I don't know what it is. I just can't seem to stay awake. Which, word to the wise, is not what you want to say on an anniversary date. I could see this graph in my wife's head. I could see this graph where, when we first met, we were actually bartenders, strangely enough, in Arizona. We would get off shift at 2 a.m. and even drive to Tucson all night to have breakfast. I could stay awake for a long time. Then we moved to Seattle, sleepy Seattle, and I took a job, and all of a sudden it was about 10 o'clock, and I would fall asleep in my mid-30s. And here I was in my mid-40s, and 8 p.m. was my limit. And she was wondering, when does this graph cross the x-axis to where I don't even wake up? And it was looking to be by my mid-60s. But I raise this because there's 2 issues. One is this was an adverse drug event. We talk about these in healthcare every day. They happen every day in healthcare. And there's the patient safety issue. How do we prevent adverse drug events? But I got to tell you, that's not what my wife was focusing in on. Her issue was, how was I going to atone for this sin? And she started meting out disciplinary sanction. She said, Dave, you are going to come out into the patio. You're going to listen to 2 songs. And she said, it was sort of the dagger through the heart, she said, I want to experience what the night was going to be like. And she said, she then, took me home and put me to sleep. Not like a dog, but let me go to sleep. But these are the issues that healthcare providers are facing. Julie Tao is the name of a nurse and worked at St. Mary's Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. About the same time as my date, a few months of difference from my date, a couple years ago, Julie Tao was helping her young patient, Jasmine Gant, give birth to her first child. Jasmine was 16 years old. And through a series of mistakes, 2 IV bags made it into the room. Actually, one was epidural, bupivacaine, and one was penicillin for a strep infection. And Julie ended up giving the bupivacaine IV rather than the penicillin. And we lost Jasmine Gant right then and there. We were able to save the child, but we lost Jasmine Gant. As a result, the state of Wisconsin criminally prosecuted Julie Tao. Up to 6 years in jail. She's been told by the feds she cannot work at any hospital that receives federal funding. We've ended her career. We lose 44,000, 98,000 deaths each year due to medical errors in our hospitals, 100,000 due to hospital-acquired infection. And we live in a culture of fear within healthcare. That if I raise my hand and say I've made a mistake, I will fall far short of that standard of perfection. That's why we talk about just culture. I'm going to take you through the design of the socio-technical system, just an introduction to that. I'm going to talk about how we stand the judgment of healthcare providers, how we live with our own fallibility, the just culture model, and then what's happening around states across the country. Here in North Carolina was an early adopter. California now. We have 60 or 70 organizations that have signed on to really try to change the safety culture in healthcare as it relates to accountability. It really relates to what you and I can expect of our healthcare provider. It starts with the design of our system. Values and expectations. What do we want out of our healthcare system? What values do we put forward? Privacy, dignity, compassion, safety of not only the patient, but safety of our employee. And ultimately, as we see in the national debate, access. And what expectations do we have around those? How good do we want to be around privacy? How good do we want to be around patient safety? And then we do the 2 things that we have available to us. We design a good, reliable, safe system around our employees. And then we ask them to make good choices in those systems. And then we hope, or if you will, pray for successful outcomes. System design. We know a lot as systems engineers. We know how to manipulate performance shaping factors in the environment. We know how to add in what we call engineering controls, barriers, recovery, redundancy. Any of you ever lock your keys in the car? Show of hands. Anybody? Yeah, I have a 1994 Honda Accord, and I've never done it in that Honda Accord. Because you know what Honda says? Honda says, look, if you want to lock the door of your Honda Accord, you get out of the car, you close the door, you take your key and you put it in. This is pre-key fob days. You put your key in, you turn it. Now, if you leave your keys on the seat and you press the button on the door and you close the door, Honda says, no deal, we're opening it back up again. You have to have your keys on the outside. Now, my Chevy Suburban, you know the Chevy commercials, it's all about freedom and the open road. Chevy says, if you want the freedom to lock your keys in the car, we're going to give it to you. And Chevy just says, press the button, wherever your keys are, close the door, your door is locked. And sure enough, I have locked my keys in my Chevy Suburban. But we know a lot about system design, how to prevent errors, how to add in redundancy. Every airplane, every commercial airliner has 2 engines, 3 hydraulic systems, 3 electrical systems, 2 pilots up front. Essentially, the Federal Aviation Administration says, we're not going to let one equipment failure or one human failure get in the way of passenger safety. We're not going to let one equipment failure get you there. We're going to have redundancy. So we know how to design good systems. And then we ask our employees to come into those systems and make good choices. One, we ask employers, and you can think about this as you as employers, we have these things that we call duties to produce outcomes. Be to work on time, bring a badge, don't steal, don't go into whoever it is, medical record. There's just certain things where we say to our employees, look, you're accountable for the result here. Don't use profanity at work. If you do, maybe this isn't the right place for you to work. We say to our employees, well, we're going to tell you how to do some of the things. 2 patient identifiers, hand hygiene, per the CDC standards. 2 patient identifiers per the Joint Commission guidelines. How we repair the pump is very procedural. So we say to our employees, come in and do it our way. And if you do it our way, we as a system will produce good results. And then we ultimately say to our employees, hey, do the right thing. Above all, do the right thing, and this is the higher duty. At Plano Presbyterian Hospital in Plano, Texas, right next to our little town, Kitty Lung was the director of nursing, and Kitty Lung talks about walking to her office on the general med surg floor, and she sees a patient beginning to roll out of bed, and Kitty darts in real quick, and that patient's beginning to roll out of bed, and first thing she's thinking is, I got to keep this patient from hitting the floor. But for those in healthcare, you know those CDC standards, right, for hand hygiene. What's Kitty supposed to do before she touches the patient? Wash her hands. So Kitty clings. Kitty says, cling to the sheets. Give me 15 seconds. No, I'm only kidding. She doesn't do that. She says, I understand there's a procedural rule. I understand we're trying to up our hand hygiene scores, but now's not the time. Now is the time to touch the patient. Now, it's interesting. Kitty tells a story because actually she touched the patient, lifted it back up, breached her procedural duty, did what was the right thing, not causing unjustifiable risk of harm. And then as she turns away, a staff nurse turns to her, because she's now thinking, I'm going to go back to my office. A staff nurse turns to her and says, hand hygiene. Because the staff nurse was saying, okay, don't wash your hands going in, but definitely wash your hands going out. And Kitty had just forgot about it. So it's about doing this, values and expectations, design safe systems, help people make good choices, and then sort of live with the outcomes, and we hope for successful outcomes. Occasionally, though, like in the case of Jasmine Gant and Julie Tao, we have an undesirable outcome. Or if you look at Dennis Quaid at Cedars-Sinai, we have his children who are harmed, and we stand in judgment. We stand in judgment of the providers, the hospital, the regulator, and the healthcare system. Is the healthcare system meeting our expectations as citizens who use this healthcare system? And for the most part today, around safety and quality, we're saying no. It's not as good as we want it to be. The question is, how do we get it to a better place? Back at the time of the IOM report, Lucian Leap, he was a doctor at Harvard. He testified before Congress. He was arguably the father of the modern patient safety movement. He testified before Congress that the single greatest impediment to error prevention in the medical industry is that we punish people for making mistakes. He said it was his culture where we would report only what we cannot hide. We'd report only what we cannot hide. He said we have an overly punitive culture. And if you look at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality's Patient Safety Culture Survey, there's like 43 items on the survey. Just about to a T, every single hospital scores most poorly on this issue. And that is staff perception that if they make a mistake, they will be punished, which prevents them raising their hand. Because prior to Jasmine Gant losing her life, there were precursors at St. Mary's Hospital that we could have seen and fixed had people raised their hand and said, I see a problem. And that's always the case. The problem is, how do we get people to raise their hand? Not everyone agrees with Lucian Leap. When I went to law school, they said experts come in pairs. So this is the flip side of the coin. And I saw this in reference to the Herald of Free Enterprise. It was the ferry boat that crosses the English Channel, and what you see on the pictures on the left-hand side is the boat when it's upright. Well, one day this ferry boat crossed the English Channel, a crew member left the bow door open. And the boat ultimately took on water until the boat capsized. 193, 194 people lost their lives. Lord Denny looks into events like that, and this is his quote: there are activities in which the degree of professional skill which must be required is so high, the consequence is so serious, that one failure to perform in accordance with standards is enough to justify dismissal. Lord Denny's saying, look, what should we expect of the airline pilot What should we expect of the school bus driver that takes our kids back and forth to school? What should we expect of our healthcare provider? Are there not some jobs in the world that are so critical that one breach is enough to justify dismissal? Now, this may be the moral high ground. Maybe Lucian's being weak in his statement. Maybe we really need to say perfection is the standard. The problem is, if we had this as our disciplinary record, our disciplinary policy, whether you're a hospital or any kind of employer, would this really work? Would this work? And the answer is no way. We say that there's 100,000 people who will lose their lives this year due to hospital-acquired infection in the U.S. 100,000 lives. What's the number one thing you and I are taught to do to prevent hospital-acquired infection? It's the last thing the commissioner said. Wash your hands. I spoke up in D.C. to a group of NASA engineers, an exciting bunch, and said, here's the deal, 100,000 lives, number one thing you do is wash your hands. Okay, give me an estimate of what you think our national rate, compliance rate is with hand hygiene protocols in our nation's hospitals. Given the fact that it's 100,000 lives, and the number one thing you do is wash your hands, what's the compliance rate? And they look at me like, Dave, this is a no-brainer. It must be 99.9%. Would you guess 60%? This model, what I showed up here, one breach is enough to justify dismissal, would wipe out health care in a week just based on CDC standards for hand hygiene. Because it's not like 40% of our staff are non-compliant. It's like 90% of our staff are non-compliant at least once during the week. So the standard is perhaps too high in Lord Denning's view. The other side of the coin, Don Norman wrote a great book called The Design of Everyday Things. It's a great introduction to human factors. He said, people make errors which lead to accidents, accidents lead to deaths. The standard solution is to blame the people involved. If we find out who made the errors and we punish them, we solve the problem. He says wrong. The problem was seldom the fault of an individual. It is the fault of the system. Change the people without changing the system and the problems will continue. This is what I was trying to convince my wife. Honey, it was the Benadryl, not me. Sure, the Benadryl said, may cause drowsiness, do not take with alcohol. But you got to read it. I have a Y chromosome. It's against the code. Help me on this one, guys. Do you think she bought that? No. The two Northwest Airlines pilots who decided to have cocktails prior to their flight. Is that a system issue? Well, we do put bars in airports. We do load up the whole galley of the airplane with alcohol. I mean, there is a system contributor, but at the end of the day, we say, look, pilots, this isn't for you. It's for the guy back in row 17 whose job it is to guard the emergency exit. He's the guy that gets to be tanked. All right, seriously, let me take you over to aviation. Being a regulator is not an easy job. It's not an easy job at all because you have to create standards. And here are the standards. If you're a pilot, this is sort of the high-level rule about the code for what we expect of pilots. No person may operate an aircraft in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger life or property of another. I mean, it's very legal-like, but that's the rule. That's the rule. And the FAA says, look, if you violate this rule, whether you're a private pilot or a commercial pilot, we're coming after you. We can fine you, and we can even pull your certificate. Not a big deal for a private pilot, but if you're a commercial pilot, we end your career. But you got to violate the rule. The question is, what does this mean? You can think of reckless like reckless driving on the road. Okay, we don't want pilots buzzing their tower or buzzing their homes with passengers in the back. But what does that word careless mean? What does it mean to be careless? If you feel unjustly disciplined by the FAA, you appeal to the National Transportation Safety Board. They're the first court of appeals. And what I want to show you is what an NTSB official or administrative law judge identified as the meaning of the word careless. Because remember, if you violate this rule, the FAA says we're coming after you. Now, take a look, and I'm not going to read through, just take a look at this interpretation of the word careless. A simple act of omission, ordinary negligence, a human mistake. A human mistake. What's the expectation of pilots here in the U.S.? What's the expectation? The expectation is perfection. If you make a mistake, you are labeled careless, and the FAA says we have the ability, we have the authority to end your career. How many of you think pilots will raise their hand and go to the FAA and say, you know what, I want to report a mistake I make in the interest of safety? And the answer is nobody does it, unless you can find a way to work around this rule. And every safe haven for reporting we've created has been a workaround to this rule. We even say report to NASA, because we, the FAA, don't want to see the data. Because if we see the data, we have to take action, and none of you will be left. Speaking of human error. All right, now come over to healthcare for a moment. This is where I went to law school in Washington State. And Washington doesn't have careless versus reckless. Washington State says we have two types of providers in Washington State. We have professional providers and unprofessional providers. There's only two groups. And these are the things that constitute unprofessional conduct. There's about 25 of them, but I want to walk through a couple of them. The commission of any act or involving moral turpitude, dishonesty, or corruption. Okay, that seems to be pretty unprofessional. Misrepresentation or fraud. That seems unprofessional. Willful betrayal of a patient practitioner privilege. Abuse of a client. These are all unprofessional conduct, but you get to the last one. Incompetence, negligence, or malpractice, which may result in an injury or which constitutes an unreasonable risk that an injury may occur. All right, and we got that word negligence in there, which we just saw identified as human error. The bottom line is in Washington State, essentially we have perfect providers who are called professional, and then if you're imperfect and you make a mistake, and by the way, would the failure to comply with hand hygiene protocol put me in an unreasonable risk the patient may be injured? So all of a sudden, I was out in Seattle about 6 months ago, 150 managers at a large healthcare facility. I said, how many of you engage in unprofessional conduct? Of the 150, how many raised their hand? All of them. Because they said, look, every one of us is less than perfect. And if we're less than perfect, the state of Washington says, then you are unprofessional. Because the only expectation we have is that of perfection, written right into the law passed by the legislator. So this is the issue we have in healthcare that the just culture is trying to help solve. At one end of the spectrum, we have the punitive culture. Lord Denning, one breach is enough to justify dismissal. At the other end, we have the blame-free culture. Well, nobody intends to make mistakes. That's true, but what about those two Northwest Airlines pilots who decided to have cocktails prior to their flight? Aren't they held accountable? And if you go look at sentinel event investigations in healthcare today, it's always this torturous path of, is the system at fault? Is the human at fault? How do we think about accountability? Somewhere in the middle is a system of accountability that supports system safety. University Health Consortium says it's the first step to patient safety. Get accountability thought out. Living with fallibility, there's three types of fallibility I want to share with you, or some words that we're trying to use and try to bring some consistency, the way we describe who we are as human beings. The first one is human error. Inadvertently doing other than what I should do, slip, lapse, mistake. How many of you have inadvertently gone faster than the speed limit? I mean, you got to think about the consequence, you know, the place. There's a road near my house in Allen that it's a mile-long stretch, and the road's marked at 25. But the road itself, the road says 45. And you just get on this road, and you're like the little engine that could, because the police, just to make up additional, financial, revenue, they just park in the middle of this road. And once you get on it, you're stuck on it for a whole mile. And you just start the beginning of the road and say, I think I can, I'm going to do 25. And all you got to do is get in a conversation with somebody in the car. And just based on the way the road is, you just foot goes to 45. I just have to drive around the road just to avoid that mile stretch. But occasionally we make mistakes. It's the human error, even when we're not intending to do it. The second one is at-risk behavior. This is the behavior where I think I'm in a safe place. I convince myself I'm in a safe place. We're all taught to have our hands at 10 and 2. Although on the steering wheel now it's 9 and 3, because if you're at 10 and 2, you end up, if the airbag goes off, you end up punching yourself in the face. So 9 and 3 is the issue. But where are your hands today? For any of you that drove here, where were your hands? Were they on a cup of Starbucks coffee? On a cell phone? Perhaps text messaging? Eating a bowl of cereal? Tying a tie? Putting on mascara? These weren't in the driver's manual. You were supposed to have your hands at 9 and 3. This is at-risk behavior, and we see it in healthcare. I don't need to do hand hygiene. I don't need to do 2 patient identifiers because I already know who my patient is. Actually, at-risk behavior is the bigger threat than the mere mistake. I make mistakes at a 100, 1,000 rate, but my at-risk behavior might be every time I get to the task. Who needs to confirm drugs, take them out of the Pyxis unit? Because, boy, pharmacy does such a great job. If it's in that bin, boy, it is the right drug. And then we have 3 preemies in Indianapolis get overdoses of heparin because we're just not really looking at what's in our hand. And the last one is the reckless behavior. Reckless behavior is that choice where I know I'm taking a substantial and unjustifiable risk. It's the surgeon who drops an instrument up on the floor in the OR and says, 3-second rule, picks it back up. You got to believe that's reckless behavior. But 3 behaviors, human error, at risk, and reckless. And what we have done in our society and our culture is we've lost the practical differentiation. What the just culture model is, if I get my clicker to work, I want to walk through how we deal with these 3, or what the proposal is to how to deal with these 3. Human error. If you go to most human resources policies today around any hospital, most organizations, industry, or even most nursing practice acts, you'll find that human error gets you in hot water. And what we're saying in the model is, well, rather than counsel or punish the person who makes a mistake, why don't we console them? Console them. Give up on perfection as the standard. Console them. Because here's the pitch, is that you only have 2 things as a manager. If you're a CEO of an organization, whether you're a CEO of a hospital or a manufacturing plant, you only have 2 tools. And that is design good systems around your employees and help them make good choices. Once the choices are fixed, once the systems are fixed, the outcomes are now fixed. Whether I make a mistake is now just a spin of the roulette wheel. So we say console the error, but learn, why did that error occur? Often today, we just stop at who made the mistake without really understanding why it occurs. That's why Lucian Leape says we have an overly punitive system, because we're not learning why errors occur. Second, at-risk behavior. Coach. Walk up to a fellow human being and say, you know what? You should really be washing your hands. Walk up to a fellow human being in a non-disciplinary way and have a conversation with them. Coach the at-risk behavior. And then leave discipline and punishment really for the reckless behavior. So the model looks like this. Console the error, coach the at-risk, punish the reckless. And again, what we're trying to change is a culture that we created over the last 100 years here in the States, where as HR practice and as legislative practice, we have made all 3 of these a crime. Even a crime. You go to the Clean Water Act, passed by Congress. It says if you dump pollutants in the local river, it's a felony. And what kind of intent do you have to have? None. No intent whatsoever. If it just happens, it's a felony. It used to be in Old English common law that you had to have some evil intent. They called it mens rea. Not so anymore. Criminality just means that society said you breached the standard. So we criminally prosecute pilots, we criminally prosecute nurses for mistakes they make. Console the error, coach that risk, punish the reckless. That's the model. Now I just want to walk through quickly a scenario that describes this model. We had an event down in Texas, where I'm from. And in Texas we had an event that, it probably didn't make the press here, but it involved then Vice President Cheney out hunting on a ranch. Did you make the news back here? All right. He's out hunting. I just want to walk through the event real quick just to describe this model. He's out hunting. You got to set your politics aside for a few moments here as I describe this. He's out hunting. There's the ranch owner. I'm sorry, I forgot her name. She's off to the left, and Harry, the lawyer, and I don't know why that's relevant. He was a lawyer, but the lawyer who he ultimately shoots, all right. Now, Harry told Vice President Cheney who was back at the truck. So Harry, he didn't think Harry was going to be sneaking up on the right flank, and Vice President Cheney's, walking along with a shotgun, trying to flush quail out of the bush, which is a little weird. Cheney trying to flush quail from the bush. Sorry. So the quail come flying out. He knows the ranch owner's off to the left. He turns and he shoots. He's thinking there's nobody back there. Now, did he intend to shoot Harry? That's why I said set your politics aside. Did he intend to shoot Harry? No, he didn't intend to shoot Harry. That's the piece that's the human error. The model says, well, console that. Vice President Cheney, we're sorry you shot your friend. But it's not the end of the inquiry. We got to know why. We got to know how we got to this place. Were there any at-risk behaviors? Well, Vice President Cheney thought that Harry was back at the truck. He didn't see a need to turn every once in a while to make sure he's in a safe place. Just like often our healthcare provider doesn't see the need to confirm patient ID because, boy, we think we know who that patient is. The same thing. We coach that behavior. The at-risk behavior, the reckless behavior, remember the beer at lunch. Had he had the beer at 5 and shot Harry at 5:30, then maybe we'd be saying, Vice President Cheney, that's just reckless. You shouldn't be a hunter if you're going to drink before hunting. But it's differentiating in the event the component pieces. Doctors don't intend to misdiagnose. We've got to be compassionate toward that, but doctor, how did you get to the place of misdiagnosing? What were the system contributors? What were your behavioral contributors? We'll stand the judgment of those. But the mere fact that even Cedars-Sinai had an event that harmed Dennis Quaid's kids doesn't tell us anything about Cedars-Sinai, other than the fact that it tells us that they're fallible. The real issue is when the Department of Health goes in and says, okay, what was there? What was your system? What were the behavioral norms that were happening inside that hospital? Then we can stand in judgment. But the mere fact that we harmed Dennis Quaid's kids tells us nothing, absolutely nothing about the quality of care at Cedars-Sinai, other than the fact. Because you know what? Every other hospital in the country said it could have happened here. It could have happened here. The real issue is how do we get there? And that's what we can't let go of. Now, back to Vice President Cheney's events. The key to this model is this. A plaintiff's attorney in Dallas said, if Vice President Cheney, if Harry dies, we can file criminal negligence charges against Vice President Cheney. If Harry dies. Here's my question. Why does it depend upon what happens to Harry to decide what we do with Vice President Cheney? I walk into my kitchen, see my young 11-year-old baseball-playing son, Isaac, winging a fork across the kitchen at the face of his pesky 16-year-old brother. Narrowly misses his face by a couple of inches. And he knows he's caught, because I'm just walking in, it's flying across the room. So the hiding it issue doesn't work for him. So he's thinking, how am I going to get out of this? He's got to talk his way out of it. That's what he knows he's going to have to do. So he's thinking, okay, I know what Dad does. I know this just culture stuff. And he's thinking, health care, first do no harm. Dad, I missed. What's he arguing for? He's arguing for a form of accountability that we call no harm, no foul. If you go to Minnesota, the first statewide initiative was in Minnesota around just culture. If you ask healthcare leaders there in that state what their system of accountability was, it was that. No harm, no foul. We have turned a blind eye to the surgeon who says, I don't want to participate in your silly timeout process because I, as the surgeon, I've never had a wrong site surgery. Why am I being forced to deal with this safe site surgery protocol? Because the same pitch that I need to give Isaac is, Isaac, it's not about the outcome, it's about the quality of your choices. And that's what we say to the surgeon when it comes to his reluctance to participate in a safe site surgery protocol. The model, console the error, coach at risk, punish the reckless, is independent of the outcome. Today we have a no harm, no foul culture. If you're convicted of drunk driving in the state of Wisconsin says we will guarantee you no jail time for your first conviction. We just want to let you, guaranteed. You're not a felon in the state of Wisconsin until your 5th conviction. Until your 5th. But you kill somebody on your 1st, and you'll be in jail for up to 25 years. What is the state of Wisconsin saying to the people of Wisconsin? It's saying, you know, drunk driving is wrong. Well, it's sort of wrong. Well, don't hurt anybody. Don't hurt anybody. The real issue, it's not even what we teach our kids. What we teach our kids is, look, you got to make good choices. You can't, you're going to live in a world that you're going to make mistakes. You are going to harm people throughout your life. What dictates the rate that that's going to occur? The quality of your choices. And what we're trying to do in healthcare is to say, look, doc, it's not about whether you make a mistake or not. You are a fallible human being. You've got to give up on this notion that you're perfect. And consumers have to give up on the notion that their doctor is perfect. That doesn't mean we can't have a safer healthcare system. We do it by saying we have to create better systems and we have to expect more in the behaviors of our providers. What is just culture? It's about doing this well. Starting with values and expectations and telling local managers, and it's teaching the local manager in the hospital you only have 2 tools. You have system design, you have behavioral choices. Once that's fixed, it's just a spin of the roulette wheel. We're not going to get a perfect healthcare system. It's not in the cards. But what we can get is a much better healthcare system if we take our eyes off of the outcome, at least when it comes to managing risk, and our eyes on system design and behavioral choices. It's about moving away, and this is a game, I don't know if you've been to Chuck E. Cheese Pizza or your fair, there's a game called Whack-A-Mole. It's actually the title of our book where we just came out with. Whack-A-Mole, it's these moles pop up and you stand there with this mallet and you whack them. And then you wait for the next mole to pop up and then you whack it. Anybody played this game? Well, if you're in healthcare, you've played the game. Because it's really, to some extent, a metaphor for how we manage risk today. We stand and wait for the outcome to occur and then we whack the person who's involved. And then we wait for the next outcome. The Joint Commission Sentinel event process is this process. It is wait for the big bad event and then whack it. It's moving away from whack-a-mole to really seeing events as opportunities to understand where our system risks are and where our behavioral risks are. Knowing that we as healthcare managers, because it's a resource-limited world we live in, we have to be good stewards with very limited resources. And it's not by playing whack-a-mole. It's by saying, where can I spend my dollar that I have been given to reduce the risk of harm across everything that we value, from safety to privacy to dignity to access. It's about reinforcing the roles of risk and quality in HR, risk and quality, digging deeper. Often today, and Lucian is right, we just don't learn from the mistakes that occur. We just don't learn. You think about medical boards, you think about malpractice. The only time the plaintiff's attorney's in there is after an event has occurred. Most often the medical board's not there until an event has occurred. The real issue is we know the physician is drifting into risky choices. It's part of our human nature. What is in our system and the design of our healthcare system that identifies the drift, corrects it before the physician leads to harm, before that behavior leads to harm? We just don't have it in the system today. Risk and quality, designing better learning systems, HR side, knowing when to console, when to coach, and when to punish. For managers, knowing where my risks are, turning those risks into 2 things, system design, behavioral choices. Again, we're saying this isn't like the little engine that could. You can't will yourself to not make mistakes. The problem is we in society have said we want perfection out of our doctor. We want perfection out of the nurse. We're not going to get there. Matter of fact, just asking for perfection is causing us to have a less reliable, less safe healthcare system than we could potentially have. For staff looking for risks around me, raising our hand and saying, I made a mistake. All across the country, we have reporting systems being created to get just that to happen. To say, I've made a mistake. In aviation, in chemical industries, any high consequence industry focuses in on the quality of its learning system. And we can't have rules that say, but oh, by the way, if you raise your hand, we're coming after you, which is where we are often today. Around the country, statewide initiatives. Minnesota was the first. North Carolina Board of Nursing said, we're going to do this in North Carolina. We're going to create partnerships as a regulator. We're going to create partnerships with hospitals, and we are going to say that there's one view of accountability. When your nurse makes a mistake, we will see the event no different than you. And the North Carolina Board of Nursing, by the way, will say, look, we don't look at the outcome when we stand in judgment of the nurse. We have patients who walk into hospitals and say, why aren't you firing that nurse? We have the press walking into the hospital, why aren't you firing that nurse? We have CMS walking into hospitals and saying, why aren't you firing that nurse? Because in the interest of safety, firing the nurse is going to decrease the quality of care, because it is going to kill what we're trying to do in our learning culture. And after all, this was simply a mistake. It's not the place to fire an employee. North Carolina, the most recent is California. We have 60 or 70 organizations across the state who are all aligning to notions of what we call an open, fair, and just culture. How do we create an open learning culture, yet at the same time retain individual accountability? What's happening in individual hospitals, it's just changing perspective. These are top-down initiatives to really try to change the perspective of what you can expect of a healthcare provider. And ultimately it comes to good system design for the organization, good behavioral choices for the employees. Improving support to line managers, and really helping staff on the right direction. And the goals here are better results for the individual providers, better results for the patients, and for the organization. And ultimately what this is about doing the right thing. I had an FAA official talk to me a couple years ago. He said, Dave, good news, bad news. Bad news is I've given up on training adults. I think they're untrainable. I was like, well, that's not very good. What's the good news? He says, Dave, I used this concept in coaching my son's 8-year-old baseball team. And you watch sports. Sports tends to align better with this, actually, than the corporate world. You go watch your son or daughter play a sport. You know they're going to make mistakes. It happens. It's just part of it. Matter of fact, we design sports to introduce mistakes. That's how we differentiate LeBron James from Kobe Bryant. We want to see the air raid. They drift into at-risk behaviors, and that's why we have coaches. And then ultimately, if they're engaged in reckless behavior, we toss them from the game. But there's this assumption of risk in sports that's like, look, things are going to happen in here, but how do we really get the best out of the team? It's just in the corporate world, somehow when we got to be adults, we changed the game and we made it all about perfection. And it goes right back to what Lucian Leap testified before Congress around. He said, we've created an environment where predictably fallible human beings cannot raise their hand and say, I made a mistake, except to do it in very circuitous channels that really prevents the individual organization from learning in the way they should. So with that, that is just culture. And again, if we have a few minutes, we can take questions and answers. Otherwise, thank you so much.
We do have time for some questions, so if people would like to come forward to one of the floor mics and address your question to Mr. Marx, we do have some time for questions at this point in time. Any questions for Mr. Marx? If not, okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nancy Borglin with Bon Secours Health System. I was just wondering, in those states that have rolled it out statewide, how has that worked? What's the rollout been like?
Well, yeah, actually, in Minnesota, there's a Minnesota Alliance for Patient Safety. That's a coalition between Department of Health, professional boards, providers. Actually, Minnesota was one of the, I think, early sort of statewide coalitions, government, providers, patients advocating for patient safety. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is get alignment between what in the first rounds is regulator and regulatee, that they look at events in a very similar manner and then ultimately take it out to the public. If you look at CAPSAC, the California Patient Safety Action Coalition, their goal is to educate the public in the state of California about these principles and how we should think about the quality of care and what we can expect from our healthcare providers. So the statewide initiatives is really getting the group together. In Pennsylvania, it was the Governor's Office of Healthcare Reform that tried to pull together groups to say, can we rethink how accountability, how we should think about accountability within the state. Missouri, it's professional boards, Department of Health, and hospitals. It principally starts at acute care. It then gets into long-term care. But it's building a group together that says, should we rethink what we expect? And again, what we're talking about is not less expectation, but more. And more in the way of the robustness of the systems we design, and ultimately saying, look, we're all accountable for our choices. Just because we haven't had a bad outcome can't validate the fact that our behavior, can't validate a risky behavior. Yes?
I'm curious, I'm sorry, I'm Fran Darlington from Children's Hospital here in Richmond, and I'm curious about your opinion about anonymous reporting of errors.
Yeah, anonymous, it starts with anonymous. I've seen labor unions in very strong labor states who have said to their own represented group to say, look, put your name on this record. Own not only your successes, but own your failures. And I think ultimately that's the place we got to get to, where I raise my hand and say, I am Dave Marx, I am fallible, here's what I just did. And the anonymous reporting, I think we start there, but it's not the place we got to be. The reason we create anonymous or even non-punitive reporting systems is because we're starting with an underlying foundation that perfection is the standard. So we create anonymous, we create cat and mouse games where we even use the word immunity. Think about immunity. We give that to drug dealers to rat out on the drug kingpin, yet we give immunity to a doctor to report or a pilot to report into NASA. We give them immunity because the underlying basis is we're still a bad guy, but we're going to ask you to come forward and report. And I think the anonymous is good. I think there are even channels where I have to report around my supervisor to the hotline. But ultimately, I think we got to get to a place where professionals have to say, not only do you own your successes, but you own your failures and your mistakes, and you raise your hand and say, I own it.
Again, Bob Kramer, Norfolk Southern Corporation. At Norfolk Southern, we are proud to say that we're the safest railroad in the nation. We just won our 20th Harriman Award, which is again, the #1 railroad in safety. We had an accident about, I guess, going on 2 years. Very simple. They didn't throw the lever, killed 11 people and shut down a town. But yet we're the safest railroad. We have a whole floor of attorneys. I can tell you that probably most of the chain of command involved no longer works for Norfolk Southern. It was one simple event. The reason we behave that way is because we know we're going to have injury attorneys after us if those individuals remain and another occasion should occur. It seems to me that you need kind of an outward or an external environment in order for your premise to work.
Yeah, that's a great issue, because when you see hospitals go down this path, they do it at odds with a greater society that says we want a carcass on the wall. And so there's actually a chapter in the book which is retiring the medical malpractice in the interest of patient safety. You go to New Zealand, you cannot sue your doctor. It's just barred. You can't sue the airline when the airline crashes an airplane. It's barred. Essentially, New Zealand says, look, in the interest of public safety, you don't get to sue your doctor. There's an accident compensation scheme that essentially takes the medical malpractice, because the overuse of that piece of it, it just took it off the table and said, we as a matter of national interest, this is New Zealanders talking, we as a matter of national interest are going to take care of people who are injured. And we all heard the story of Ms. Leibowitz, I think was her name, the person at McDonald's that was scalded, it was like 10 years ago, and sued McDonald's. The issue is, why are we even in that environment? What we do, if you look at our tort system in the U.S., we call the person that makes the mistake a wrongdoer, and we call the person injured an unjustly injured victim. And what we're trying to change is it the fact that I make a mistake, does that make me a wrongdoer? If I'm reckless, I'm driving down the road reckless, okay, call me a wrongdoer. But the mere fact that we put a physician or a nurse in an environment that is destined to lead them to make mistakes, how do we then call them a wrongdoer? So there is a bigger societal issue about the plaintiff's attorneys. Now, that said, you know, I worked at a large unnamed aerospace manufacturer in the Pacific Northwest early on in my career. And chief counsel there said, look, do the right thing. My job is to protect you as best I can legally, but do the right thing. And that's the issue. Is what we need to do is allow the system or help change the system, the more global societal context, to allow us to do the right thing. Because what we have is, we have hospitals that choose not to collect data out of fear of liability. We have behaviors that just aren't the right behavior because the greater society says perfection is our only standard. So you're right, we have to tackle you can do it, but part of this movement is to really say, as a national culture, have we expected too much, and as a result get worse outcomes. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it, and we're off to break.